In the secluded depths of Idaho's Sawtooth Mountains, a solitary woodsman encounters an inexplicable sight, a German shepherd, caked in mud, lame and mute, gazing directly into his very being. The canine refuses sustenance and water, merely pivoting and commencing a slow gait as if imploring to be trailed. What follows is more than a trek through untamed land. It is an immersion into a globally suppressed secret and a connection that will irrevocably alter both man and dog. The woodland was not meant to exude such a profound sense of gravity. Grant Halden had traversed the Sawtooth Range on countless occasions. As a former firefighter who had embraced a solitary existence, he possessed the ability to interpret the wind, the earth, and the quietude. Yet, this particular silence felt laden. The atmosphere carried the scent of moss and precipitation, and the dawn mist clung low to the pine roots like digits seeking an unknown object. Grant moved with a familiar rhythm, inspecting his snares and documenting alterations in the flora for a wildfire investigation he was discreetly undertaking. However, it was neither the moss nor the atmosphere that halted him. It was a sound unheard for 3 years, not in this location, a bark, yet not an ordinary one. It was raspy, distant, and imbued with an emotion more human than canine, desperation. He pivoted gradually. The woodland stayed motionless. Then, from the boundary of the trees, a figure materialized, so incongruous it caused Grant to become still. A German shepherd, covered in mud and quivering, advanced with a pronounced limp, burdened by 1,000 unspoken narratives. Its eyes were untamed yet concentrated, its ribs discernible beneath a sparse coat, and its right forepaw scarcely made contact with the earth. Blood adhered to its ear, yet it did not vocalize again, nor did it plead. It merely stood there, observing. Grant squatted, proffered a water container, and uttered something gentle, something innate. But the canine did not partake. Instead, it swiveled its head slowly, its gaze meeting Grant's for a suspended instant, and then, soundlessly, it commenced walking into the trees. There was no alarm, no reluctance, just a peculiar, grave urgency, as if it had anticipated this precise moment, this specific individual, for an excessively prolonged period. Every fiber of Grant's being urged prudence, but the canine's eyes, they bore a significance no chart or navigational tool could elucidate. Thus, without uttering a word, Grant trailed. The vegetation grew denser as they ventured further into the forest, distant from any recognized path. Grant observed the dog's movements, swift when the way was clear, cautious when the breeze shifted. Intelligence informed every backward glance. He wasn't leading Grant aimlessly, this wasn't mere wandering. It was purpose concealed by suffering. Pine needles yielded to stones, stones to roots, and then to an unexpected discovery, deep gouges along a prostrate tree, not from the dog, but from a significantly larger creature. The forest became more obscure here, even as morning light struggled to penetrate, and still, the dog continued onward. Grant paused at a brook to replenish his canteen, but the dog persisted, offering no pause for drink or respite, only forward motion. That's when the realization struck him. The dog wasn't endeavoring to survive, it was endeavoring to reach a destination or perhaps to guide someone there. Grant was uncertain which possibility caused him greater unease. He readjusted his rucksack, his heart pounding not from the exertion of the hike, but from a deeper, rising premonition within his chest. A hidden story lay within these woods, characterized by claws, silence, and a shepherd who refused to capitulate. Somewhere ahead, the truth awaited. But the critical question wasn't whether Grant would uncover it, it was whether he would be prepared when it uncovered him. The further their journey extended, the more peculiar the surroundings became. This was not merely isolated wilderness, it was pristine, unnervingly tranquil. No avian melodies, no squirrels scampering between trees, only the rustle of desiccated twigs beneath Grant's footwear and the deliberate, almost formal steps of the canine preceding him. The landscape altered abruptly. What commenced as gentle inclines of pine needles rapidly transformed into sharp stone formations and perilous slopes strewn with branches denuded of their bark. The dog moved as if it had traversed this path previously and harbored an aversion for every part of it. Initially, Grant suspected he was experiencing a delusion. Concealed beneath the roots of a toppled birch, he detected a metallic gleam. He approached, displacing moss with his boot. A corroded section of an aircraft's body, contorted like a twisted strip and charred at the periphery, protruded from the earth. His stomach lurched. Aircraft remnants here, unidentified, unburnt, unrecorded. Vegetation had grown around it as if nature itself had endeavored to conceal the evidence. The dog did not pause. He proceeded with his limp, past the debris, ascending a track untrodden by humans for many years. Grant followed, now driven by instinct, a sense of dread coiling within him. There was no longer any uncertainty. This dog was not astray, nor was he meandering. He was guiding. The subsequent half-mile constituted an arduous trek. The forest floor was irregular, scorched in certain areas, untouched in others, an unsettling mosaic of arrested time. As they advanced, more fragments began to appear. A frayed pilot's restraint dangled from a limb like a forsaken implement of execution, a military-style boot, fractured and partially interred in the soil, and the distinct, twofold sound of metal creaking in the breeze. Despite the surrounding quietude, the impact was undeniable, and it had remained concealed, not due to being forgotten, but because an entity desired it so. The dog arrived at a constricted precipice overlooking a shallow gorge, his respiration labored, his paws quivering from the ascent. Grant joined him and peered downwards. Initially, it appeared to be merely more trees, more undergrowth, more wilderness. But his vision acclimated. The configuration was excessively orderly. Beneath a canopy of branches and accumulated decay, he discerned it, the silhouette of a downed aircraft, largely preserved, its wings buckled under collapsed trees, its tail cleanly severed. Grant's breath caught, he recoiled involuntarily, the gravity of the situation overwhelming him. How had this eluded media coverage? How had no one documented a military aircraft incident in a national forest? And who was this canine, still positioned like a guardian beside it? It was then he comprehended the dog was not protecting the location, he was protecting what remained within it. Grant descended with deliberation, the atmosphere growing heavier with each step. He glanced at the dog, who stared at the wreckage without blinking. Grief was evident in his posture, not panic, not fear, but something more ancient, more profound. The kind of sorrow that doesn't cry out, it sits in silence and waits. The wreckage didn't appear recent, but neither had it been consumed by nature. Someone or something had disturbed this place not long ago, broken branches, crushed moss, scuffed boot prints not yet erased by time. And then a faint sound, not the wind, not a bird. Metal shifting. The dog turned sharply, ears alert, but didn't move. He just waited for Grant to understand what he already knew. This wasn't overgrown history, it was unfinished business. Grant moved stealthily as he neared the fractured remains of the aircraft, the forest seemingly constricting from all directions as if it too were suppressing its respiration. The main body of the plane was contorted and breached in sections, its formerly robust structure now enmeshed in creepers and the passage of years. The dog maintained an unnerving quiet, traversing a slow circuit around a specific flank of the debris. His motions were measured, his demeanor rigid. He neither vocalized nor whimpered, he merely stood guard, as though aware of an item interred beneath the mangled metal, unwilling for it to be disturbed except by appropriate individuals. Grant's fingers traced the scorched aluminum, particles of oxidized paint flaking off at his touch. Yet, it was not the debris that caused his breath to catch. It was the sudden glimpse of a gleaming object, partially concealed beneath shattered branches and accumulated moss of many years. He knelt, clearing it away. A military-issued identification marker, bearing the name Maddox. It was not a canine's tag. It pertained to a human, and it had not entirely corroded. An individual had revisited this location recently. Adjacent to it lay a distorted container, secured and sealed in a peculiar manner, now fractured open. Its contents had been destroyed by moisture, yet one item endured. A singed survival guide marked confidential. Grant attempted to open it, but the pages adhered to one another. The few that separated revealed unusual aeronautical diagrams, a redacted mission identifier, and barely discernible coordinates inscribed in the margins. None of this corresponded to any aircraft expected to traverse this forest. The dog circled once more, emitting a prolonged, subdued moan, not of suffering, but of something more dire, acknowledgement. It was then that Grant observed the earthen elevation. Just beside the aircraft's wing, where the dog had initially commenced its pacing, the ground was clearly disrupted. Foliage and pine needles were disarranged irregularly, and moss had not fully regenerated. Grant dug with deliberation, and beneath a covering of soft, cool soil, he discovered it. A superficial burial site. No remains, no bones. Merely a frayed military uniform sleeve, a discolored insignia, and what appeared to be a damaged radio apparatus. Yet one item rested within, placed with diligence. A bloodied K-9 tactical vest, discolored, worn, yet unmistakably personalized. And across the chest piece, barely holding its form, stitched in robust lettering, dog. Grant became motionless. The quiet between them extended until it felt palpable. The dog advanced, tail lowered, and reclined beside the vest. He placed his head tenderly on its border, as he had seemingly done on countless previous nights. And now Grant comprehended the reality. This was not a stray animal that had chanced upon misfortune. This was not merely a survivor of an accident. This was a soldier's companion, a spirit that had remained, not from an inability to depart, but from an unwillingness to do so, not without someone grasping the true events that transpired here. Grant offered no words. He simply seated himself beside the dog, allowing the chill to seep into his bones, experiencing a gravity surpassing anything he had previously known. This was not merely a forgotten aircraft. This was a secret that had persisted beyond every informant, every satellite image, and every suppressed report. And yet, here was the dog still fulfilling the mission. As the wind intensified, a branch overhead creaked loudly, jolting Grant from his stupor. A change had occurred in the trees, not an avian presence, not the wind, but a watchful entity. The dog remained still. He simply waited, because the wreckage had not yet revealed all its secrets, nor had the spirits it harbored. By the time Grant found shelter beneath the overhanging rock for the evening, the sun had yielded to dense, gray clouds, extinguishing the final remnants of daylight in a shroud of quiet apprehension. The temperature descended rapidly. The dog lay curled tightly against the stone, eyes open, his body as taut as a wound spring. He was not resting, he was listening, observing. Grant assessed his findings thus far. An unrecorded aircraft incident, a K-9 identified by the name Dog, stitched onto a bloodied vest, a confidential manual, and a military identification belonging to an individual presumed living or accounted for. He re-examined the water-damaged documents, seeking any comprehensible information. One page adhered to his fingers, a fragment of a mission directive. Grant strained to decipher the barely discernible script. The phrases covert surveillance, air recon, and unauthorized corridor leaped out, along with a name, Lieutenant Julian Rowe, stamped repeatedly, each instance marked MIA. Grant had encountered that name previously, amidst the background murmur of an old news report. A pilot presumed deceased during a failed mission, quietly obscured by headlines that discouraged inquiry. So, why was his name present here, concealed within wreckage never intended for discovery? The dog shifted abruptly, his ears flicking towards the elevated ground. Grant looked upwards just as a gentle crimson luminescence pulsed through the mist like a rhythmic beat. A flare, not accidental, not from hikers, but controlled, deliberate. They were not by themselves. Grant retreated further into the rocks, his thoughts racing. He had not informed anyone of his presence here. No cellular signal, no documented trail. And this location, this forgotten aircraft, this dog, this truth, they were not merely overlooked. They had been deliberately concealed. The flare was not a signal for aid. It was a caution. Someone was aware the wreckage had been discovered. The dog rose slowly, not barking, not whining, but his body transformed. Tense, locked, tail low but steady. Grant could see it. The dog recognized the scent in the air, not just danger, but something older, familiar. And that's when the storm erupted. Rain fell hard and sudden, descending with cold fury. The wind sliced through the trees, bending the branches as if they were bowing to an approaching presence. Grant seized the drenched rucksack and reinserted the documents. Every instinct urged him to move, yet the dog remained stationary. He stood confronting the ridge, growling, not in fright, but as a warning. It was as if a trigger had been activated within him. A recollection, a signal, a voice from bygone days that no longer required words to be comprehended. Grant needed no inquiry. He understood now. The dog was not merely guiding him here for resolution. This location still held significance, and not solely for historical reasons, but for an entity that continued to observe. The understanding stung more acutely than the precipitation. This wreckage was not misplaced. It was safeguarded, concealed from satellites, search parties, and public inquisitiveness because a powerful entity desired it so. And the dog? The dog had steadfastly maintained his watch long after provisions were exhausted, long after assistance ceased. Allegiance of that caliber did not originate from conditioning. It stemmed from affection, connection, obligation, and something further, veracity. Grant enveloped the dog in the saturated vest as if it were protective gear. He uttered nothing. Words held no relevance here any longer. Only deeds, only remembrance, only the unrefined bond between a man venturing into obscurity and a canine that had inhabited it for an excessive duration. Then, another sound. Metal shifting, footwear on stone. A murmur in a tongue Grant could not quite identify. The dog advanced, eyes fixed on the blackness beyond the ridge, and Grant trailed once more into the unfamiliar. Because once one has glimpsed the periphery of something interred so profoundly, retreat is not an option. One excavates. Grant did not slumber, not even briefly. Precipitation battered the woodland's upper layer throughout the night, yet it was not the tempest that prevented his rest. It was the quietude beneath it, that subdued sort of menace that resonates beneath the surface, expectant, the kind that feels intimate. The dog stayed vigilant, motionless, his gaze fixed on the boundary of trees as though an entity or object were about to materialize. The sensation of being observed was no longer a product of paranoia. It was an established fact. Just prior to dawn, a change occurred. A muffled report in the distance. Not thunder, but wood, then another. And then voices, low, measured, the kind trained to remain below the wind's level. Grant recognized those voices, not from personal acquaintance, but from professional experience. They belonged to individuals who preferred to remain unheard, individuals skilled in vanishing within forests such as this. The dog emitted a sound that was not a growl but more of an admonition, a vocal cue, restrained yet sharp, instructing Grant to move immediately. Grant donned his drenched equipment, seized the pack containing the documents, and followed the dog back towards the crash site. However, the dog was not proceeding towards the wreckage this time. He moved towards a slope Grant had not previously observed, partially concealed beneath fallen branches and ferns, barely discernible. The dog sniffed at the edge of what appeared to be merely loose stones, then commenced digging, swiftly, urgently. Grant assisted, clearing debris until metal struck his palm. A hatch, corroded, almost sealed shut. Yet, there it was, a concealed compartment integrated into the slope. They forced it open collectively. The atmosphere within was musty, undisturbed. The dog entered without reluctance. Grant followed. The interior was confined yet arid, containing provisions, military sustenance, aged water receptacles, a signaling apparatus, and, most significantly, a metallic container secured with a governmental marking. Atop this container, affixed with aged, discolored plastic, lay a chart, hand-drawn, marked in red. Grant spread it across his lap. His breath hitched. This was not merely an aeronautical route. It was a passage through restricted airspace, traversing territories officially unrecognized on any civilian map. The red indicator pointed towards a location designated solely by a date and a single term, event. The dog lay beside the chart, his respiration shallow, yet his eyes still burned with concentration. It was as if he comprehended what they were observing, as if he had awaited someone to perceive it. The quiet in the refuge was broken only by the wind pressing against the hatch above and Grant's heart hammering in his chest. However, the perception of security was fleeting. Externally, a novel sound pierced the morning. The acute whine of an unmanned aerial vehicle, not directly above, but proximate, excessively so, and not of civilian origin. This one moved deliberately, with precision, and in a searching manner, the type employed to track thermal indicators, to secure targets, to survey, then vanish. Grant became motionless. The hatch remained slightly unlatched. He crept towards it cautiously, peering just sufficiently to observe the drone's crimson sensor sweep past and halt precisely where they had established camp the previous night. Then it pivoted towards the crash site. Grant swiftly retreated and sealed the hatch just as the buzzing sound passed overhead. He and the dog now sat in absolute darkness, Nothing but shared breath and memory between them. And it was then that the situation became clear. This wreck was not merely sensitive. It was still active. And whoever had been searching was not attempting to find survivors. They were ensuring the silence remained unbroken, permanently. But the dog had waited, guarded, endured. And now he had Grant. This was no longer just a rescue. It was a relay, and Grant now held the baton. The tempest had subsided, yet the unease persisted. Dawn's light permeated the trees like a faint rhythm, creating extended silhouettes across the drenched forest floor. Grant remained hunched within the concealed shelter, the fragile chart spread before him, his fingertips tracing the inscriptions as if they might vanish with a mere blink. The coordinates marked in crimson were not simply military jargon. They represented flight paths, clandestine ones, navigating through territories officially unrecognized. These were not accidental occurrences. This particular crash was never intended to be documented, never meant to be found. The dog sat beside him, rigid as stone, still refusing to rest. His gaze remained fixed on the shelter's entrance, yet periodically it would shift to Grant, a silent inquiry, "Are you still with me?" And the response, though unvoiced, was affirmative. Grant was no longer merely involved. He was inextricably linked to the narrative in ways even he did not yet fully comprehend. The container from the shelter lay unopened on the floor between them. It possessed no lock, no keypad, merely a substantial twist seal with a governmental marking so aged it flaked at the periphery. Grant unfastened Forma. At the heart of the isolated Sawtooth Mountains in Idaho, a solitary survivalist encounters an enigma. A mud-caked German shepherd, limping and silent, its gaze piercing his very soul. The dog refuses food and water, instead turning and beginning to walk, an unspoken plea to be followed. What transpires is not merely a trek through the wilderness, but an odyssey into a globally suppressed secret and a bond that will irrevocably transform both man and canine. The forest was not meant to feel this oppressive. Grant Halden had traversed the Sawtooths countless times. A former firefighter turned self-reliant woodsman, he knew how to interpret wind, soil, and silence. But this particular silence felt charged. The air carried the scent of moss and rain, and the morning mist clung low to the pine roots like fingers searching for something lost. Grant moved with practiced efficiency, checking his traps and noting changes in vegetation for a wildfire study he was quietly conducting. But it wasn't the moss or the air that brought him to a halt. It was a sound he hadn't heard in 3 years, not in this remote location, a bark, but not just any bark. It was hoarse, faint, and laden with an emotion far more human than canine: desperation. He turned slowly. The forest remained still. Then, from the tree lean, emerged a figure so out of place it made Grant freeze. A German shepherd, caked in mud and trembling, limped forward with the weight of 1,000 unspoken stories. His eyes were wild yet focused, his ribs visible beneath a patchy coat, and his front right paw barely touched the ground. Blood clung to his ear, but he didn't bark again. He didn't beg. He just stood there, watching. Grant crouched, extended a canteen, whispered something soft, something instinctive. But the dog didn't drink. Instead, he turned his head slowly, locking eyes with Grant for a breathless moment, and then, without a sound, began to walk into the trees. There was no panic, no hesitation, just a strange, solemn urgency, as if he had waited for this exact moment, for this exact man, for far too long. Every instinct in Grant's body screamed caution, but the eyes of that dog, they carried a weight no map or compass could explain. So, without a word, Grant followed. The terrain grew more dense as they ventured deeper into the forest, far from any known trail. Grant noticed the dog moved in bursts, quick when the path was clear, cautious when the wind shifted. There was intelligence behind every glance back. He wasn't leading Grant randomly, this wasn't aimless wandering. It was purpose cloaked in pain. Pine needles gave way to rocks, rocks to roots, and then to something Grant hadn't expected, deep claw marks along a fallen tree, not from the dog, but from something much larger. The forest grew darker here even as morning light struggled to penetrate, and still the dog pressed on. Grant paused at a stream to fill his canteen, but the dog kept walking. No drink, no rest, just forward. That's when it hit him. The dog wasn't trying to survive, he was trying to get somewhere, or perhaps get someone there. Grant wasn't sure which possibility made his stomach churn more. He adjusted his pack, his heart pounding not from the hike, but from something deeper, something rising like a warning inside his chest. There was a story buried in these woods, and it had claws, silence, and a shepherd who refused to give up. Somewhere up ahead, the truth waited. But the question wasn't if Grant would find it, the question was, would he be ready when it found him? The farther they journeyed, the stranger everything felt. This wasn't just remote wilderness, it was untouched, unnaturally still. No bird song, no squirrels darting from tree to tree, just the crackle of dry twigs under Grant's boots and the deliberate, almost ceremonial steps of the dog ahead of him. The terrain shifted violently. What started as gentle pine beds quickly turned into jagged stone ridges and treacherous inclines littered with branches stripped clean of bark. The dog moved like he'd been here before and hated every inch of it. At first, Grant thought he was hallucinating. Nestled beneath the roots of a fallen birch, he noticed something gleaming metal. He stepped closer, nudging away moss with his boot. A rusted chunk of fuselage, bent like ribbon and scorched around the edges, jutted from the ground. His stomach sank. Plain debris here. Unmarked, unburned, unreported. Trees had grown around it, as if nature had tried to bury the evidence. The dog didn't wait. He limped ahead, past the wreckage, up a trail no man had walked in decades. Grant followed instinctively now, a pit crawling in his gut. There was no doubt in his mind anymore. This dog wasn't lost. He wasn't wandering, he was leading. The next half-mile was a brutal hike. The forest floor was uneven, charred in some places, fresh in others. An eerie patchwork of time standing still. The further they moved, the more pieces began to show. A torn pilot's seat belt hung from a branch like a forgotten noose. A military-grade boot, cracked and half-buried in soil, and the sound, twice, of something creaking metal in the wind. Despite the silence surrounding them, the crash was real, and it had stayed hidden, not because it was forgotten, but because someone wanted it that way. The dog reached a narrow ledge that overlooked a shallow ravine, his breathing ragged, his paws trembling from the climb. Grant caught up and looked down. At first, it looked like just more trees, more brush, more wild. But his eyes adjusted. The pattern was too clean. Beneath a cover of branches and years of decay, he saw it. The outline of a wrecked aircraft, mostly intact, its wings crumpled beneath collapsed trees, the tail sheared clean off. Grant's breath caught. He stepped back without meaning to, the weight of the moment crashing over him. How was this not in the news? How had no one reported a military crash in a national forest? And who was this dog, still standing like a sentinel beside it? That's when he realized. The dog wasn't guarding the site. He was guarding what was left inside it. Grant climbed down slowly, the air thicker with every step. He glanced at the dog, who stared at the wreckage without blinking. There was grief in his stance. Not panic, not fear, something older, deeper. The kind of sadness that didn't scream. It sat in silence and waited. The wreckage didn't look new, but it hadn't been swallowed by nature either. Something or someone had disturbed this place recently. Broken branches, crushed moss, scuffed boot prints not yet faded by time. And then, a faint sound. Not the wind, not a bird. Metal shifting. The dog turned sharply, ears alert, but didn't move. He just waited for Grant to understand what he already knew. This wasn't overgrown history. It was unfinished business. Grant crouched low as he moved closer to the shattered shell of the plane. The forest pressing in on every side like it, too, was holding its breath. The fuselage was buckled and torn in places, its once proud frame now tangled in vines and time. The dog remained eerily silent, pacing in a slow circle around one particular side of the wreckage. His movements deliberate, his posture tense. He didn't bark, didn't whimper. He simply guarded, as if he knew something was buried beneath the twisted metal and didn't want it touched unless it was by the right hands. Grant's fingers ran across scorched aluminum, flakes of oxidized paint crumbling under his touch. But it wasn't the debris that made his breath hitch. It was the sudden sight of something glinting, half-buried beneath broken branches and decades of moss. He knelt down, brushing it away. A military-issued ID tag, name Maddox. It wasn't a dog's tag. It belonged to a human, and it hadn't rusted entirely. Someone had returned here recently. Right next to it was a warped case, locked and sealed in a strange way, now cracked open. Its contents had been ravaged by water, but one thing survived, A scorched survival manual marked confidential. Grant flipped it open, but the pages stuck together. The few that peeled loose showed strange flight schematics, a blacked-out mission title, and barely legible coordinates scribbled in the margins. None of this matched anything that should have flown over this forest. The dog circled again and let out a long, low moan. It wasn't pain, it was something worse, recognition. That's when Grant saw the mound. Just beside the fuselage wing, where the dog had first begun pacing, the earth had clearly been disturbed. Leaves and pine needles were pushed aside unevenly and moss hadn't fully grown back. Grant dug slowly, and beneath a layer of soft, cold dirt he found it, a shallow grave. There was no body, no bones, just a torn military uniform sleeve, a faded patch, and what looked like a shattered radio unit. But there was one thing resting inside, placed with care, a blood-stained K9 tactical vest, faded, frayed, but unmistakably personalized. And across the chest plate, barely holding together, stitched in thick letters, dog. Grant froze. The silence between them stretched until it felt alive. The dog walked forward, tail low, and lay down beside the vest. He rested his head gently on the edge like he'd done it 1,000 nights before. And now Grant saw the truth. This wasn't a stray who'd wandered into tragedy. This wasn't just a survivor of a crash. This was a soldier's partner, a soul that had stayed behind, not because he couldn't leave, but because he wouldn't, not without someone understanding what really happened out here. Grant didn't speak. He simply sat down beside the dog, letting the cold creep into his bones, feeling a weight deeper than anything he'd known. This wasn't just a forgotten plane, this was a secret that had outlived every whistleblower, every satellite scan, and every hushed-up report. And yet here was the dog, still carrying the mission. As the wind picked up, a branch creaked high above, snapping Grant out of his haze. Something had shifted in the trees, not a bird, not the wind. A presence, watching. The dog didn't move. He just waited because the wreckage wasn't done speaking, and neither were the ghosts it kept. By the time Grant settled beneath the cliff outcropping for the night, the sun had surrendered to thick gray clouds, smothering the last of the light in a blanket of quiet dread. The temperature dropped quickly. The dog curled tightly against the stone, eyes open, body taut like a coiled spring. He wasn't resting, he was listening, watching. Grant took inventory of what he'd found so far: an unrecorded crash, a K9 with the name dog stitched into a bloody vest, a confidential manual, and a military ID belonging to someone who was supposed to be alive or accounted for. He flipped through the water-damaged documents again, searching for anything coherent. One page clung to his fingers, a mission briefing fragment. Grant squinted at the barely legible text. The words covert surveillance, air recon, and unauthorized corridor jumped out, and a name, Lieutenant Julian Rowe, stamped multiple times. Each line marked MIA. Grant had heard that name before, somewhere in the background noise of an old news cycle. A pilot presumed dead during a failed mission, quietly buried in headlines no one was allowed to ask about. So why was his name here, tucked inside a wreck that was never meant to be found? The dog shifted suddenly, his ears flicking toward the ridge. Grant looked up just as a soft red glow pulsed through the fog like a heartbeat, a flare. Not random, not from hikers. Controlled, intentional. They were not alone. Grant backed deeper into the rocks, his mind racing. He hadn't told anyone he was here. No cell signal, no paper trail. And this site, this forgotten plane, this dog, this truth, they weren't just overlooked, they'd been buried. The flare wasn't a signal of help, it was a warning. Someone knew the wreckage had been found. The dog rose slowly, not barking, not whining, but his body changed, tense, locked, tail low but steady. Grant could see it. The dog recognized the scent in the air, not just danger, but something older, familiar. And that's when the storm broke. Rain poured hard and sudden, hammering down with cold fury. The wind sliced through the trees, bending the branches like they were bowing to something approaching. Grant grabbed the soaked backpack and tucked the documents back inside. Every instinct screamed to move, but the dog didn't budge. He stood facing the ridge, growling, not in fear, in warning. It was like something had been triggered in him, a memory, a signal, a voice from the past that no longer needed words to be heard. Grant didn't need to ask. He understood it now. The dog wasn't just guiding him here for closure. This place still mattered, and not just to history, but to someone who was still watching. The realization stung more than the rain. This wreck wasn't lost. It was protected, hidden from satellites, search teams, public curiosity, because someone powerful wanted it that way. And Dog had refused to leave his post long after food ran out, long after help stopped coming. Loyalty like that didn't come from training. It came from love, bond, duty, and something else, truth. Grant wrapped the soaked vest around the dog like armor. He didn't say anything. Words had no place here anymore, only action, only memory, only the raw connection between a man stumbling into darkness and a dog who had lived in it for far too long. Then another sound. Metal shifting, boots over stone. A whisper in a language Grant couldn't quite place. The dog stepped forward, eyes locked on the blackness beyond the ridge, and Grant followed again, into the unknown. Because once you've been shown the edge of something buried this deep, you don't turn back. You dig. Grant didn't sleep, not even for a moment. Rain lashed at the forest canopy all night, but it wasn't the storm that kept him awake. It was the silence beneath it, that quiet kind of threat that hums under the skin, waiting, the kind that feels personal. The dog remained alert, unmoving, his gaze locked on the tree line as though someone or something was about to emerge. The sense of being watched wasn't paranoia anymore. It was fact. Just before dawn, something shifted. A muffled crack in the distance. Not thunder, wood, then another. And then voices. Low, measured, the kind trained to never rise above the wind. Grant knew those voices not personally but professionally. They belonged to men who didn't want to be heard, men who were taught how to disappear in forests like this. The dog let out a sound that wasn't a growl but more of a warning. A vocal signal, restrained but sharp, telling Grant to move, now. Grant threw on his soaked gear, grabbed the pack with the documents, and followed the dog back toward the crash site. But the dog wasn't heading for the wreckage this time. He moved toward a slope Grant hadn't noticed before, half buried under deadfall and ferns, barely visible. The dog nosed at the edge of what looked like nothing more than loose rock, then began pawing fast, urgent. Grant joined in, moving debris aside until metal clanged under his palm. A hatch, rusted, nearly fused shut, but there, a hidden compartment built into the slope. They wrenched it open together. The air inside was stale, untouched. The dog jumped in without hesitation. Grant followed. Inside was tight but dry. Supplies, military rations, old water containers, a signaling kit, and most importantly, a steel canister sealed with a government tag. On top of the canister, taped with aged, yellowing plastic, was a map, hand-drawn, marked in red. Grant unrolled it across his lap. His breath caught. This wasn't just a flight path. It was a route through restricted airspace, crossing borders that didn't officially exist on any civilian map. The red marker pointed toward a location labeled with nothing but a date and a single word, event. The dog lay down beside the map, his breathing shallow, but eyes still burning with focus. It was like he understood what they were looking at, like he had waited for someone to see it. The quiet in the shelter was broken only by the wind pressing against the hatch above and Grant's heart hammering in his chest. But the sense of safety didn't last. Outside, a new sound cracked through the morning. The high-pitched whine of a drone. Not overhead, but near, too near, and not civilian. This one moved slow, precise, and searching, the kind used to follow heat signatures, to lock targets, to sweep, then vanish. Grant froze. The hatch was still slightly ajar. He crawled to it carefully, peeking just enough to see the red eye of the drone sweep past and pause, exactly where they had camped the night before. Then it pivoted toward the crash. Grant pulled back fast and sealed the hatch just as the sound buzzed over. He and the dog sat in complete darkness now, nothing but breath and memory between them. And that's when it became clear, this wreck wasn't just sensitive, it was still active. And whoever had been searching wasn't trying to find survivors, they were making sure the silence stayed unbroken forever. But the dog had waited, guarded, endured. And now he had Grant. This wasn't just a rescue anymore, it was a relay, and Grant was now holding the baton. The storm had passed, but the tension hadn't. Dawn filtered through the trees like a weak pulse, casting long shadows across the soaked forest floor. Grant sat hunched in the hatch shelter, the brittle map spread out in front of him, his fingertips tracing the ink like it might disappear if he blinked. The coordinates marked in red weren't just military gibberish, they were flight paths, covert ones, weaving through territories that didn't officially exist. These weren't accidents, this crash was never meant to be logged, never meant to be discovered. The dog sat beside him, stiff as stone, still refusing to rest. His eyes stayed locked on the hatch door, but every so often they'd shift to Grant, checking in silently, asking, "Are you still with me?" And the answer, though unspoken, was yes. Grant wasn't just involved anymore, he was bound to the story in ways even he didn't fully understand yet. The canister from the hatch sat unopened on the floor between them. It had no lock, no keypad, just a heavy twist seal with a government tag so old it flaked at the edges. Grant cracked it open with effort. Inside were waterproof sleeves filled with photos, mission documents, and one weatherproof drive. The photos stopped his breath cold. They weren't of the crash, they were surveillance shots, blurred infrared, time-stamped at night, showing small towns, rural areas, schools, hospitals, and in each, something circled in red, unmarked trucks, fires, individuals whose faces had been blacked out in ink. What exactly was being transported here? This wasn't a recon mission, it was a cover-up route. And then he found the note, a single sheet of paper, handwritten, folded with care. "If this is all that's left, tell the world what happened. I couldn't." Signed, Lieutenant Julian Rowe. Grant sat back, the weight of the note hitting harder than the storm outside ever had. This was never just about aviation routes or hidden cargo, it was about someone who had tried to speak, tried to act, and got silenced, literally. The dog had carried the story with him, waded through hunger, through cold, through abandonment, not just for closure, but for a witness. A sudden buzz snapped Grant out of it. Outside the hatch, the drone had returned, closer this time, lingering. And then a new sound, a faint mechanical chirp. Grant's blood froze. A tracker. Somewhere in the wreckage, maybe on the dog, maybe on the documents, something had been tagged. And now, whoever buried this secret knew someone was here and knew exactly where to find them. Grant closed the canister and stuffed everything into his pack. He reached out and touched the dog's shoulder. The dog didn't flinch, he simply stood and turned toward the hatch, waiting. There was no running now, no hiding, only forward. But as Grant reached for the handle, he realized something more terrifying than exposure. If they tagged the wreckage and they were closing in, they weren't here to recover data or protect some classified narrative. They were here to erase what was left. And that meant both of them, Grant and the dog, were now part of the evidence. And evidence in a story this buried doesn't walk away unless it fights its way out. The dog moved first. No command, no hesitation. He darted from the hatch, nose low, body tense but controlled, every inch of him trained for movement through danger. Grant followed close behind, clutching the backpack tight against his chest, the weight of that sealed canister pressing into his ribs with every step. He didn't ask where they were going, he just trusted the dog knew. Because at this point, the dog wasn't following instinct, he was following memory. They weaved through dense undergrowth, rain-soaked branches snapping back in their faces. The forest floor a chaotic blend of mud and pine needles. Grant didn't stop until the dog stopped. Just ahead, nestled between two moss-covered boulders, was a crate, a real one, military-issued, locked tight with a weatherproof seal, camouflaged to blend in with the forest. The dog didn't approach it like it was new, he approached it like it was sacred. Grant knelt, his hands trembling as he pried open the latch. Inside was a waterproof tablet, still blinking, still alive, the kind used for field briefings. The battery was low, but it pulsed red like a dying heartbeat. Grant powered it on. The screen flickered once, twice, then came the face, Lieutenant Julian Rowe, pale, blood on his temple, his breath short and labored. He looked straight into the camera, voice raw and cracked. "If you're watching this, it means I didn't make it. We weren't transporting weapons. We weren't even supposed to be in that airspace. We were carrying proof of what they did in those towns, test zones, unauthorized ops, civilian exposure." He winced, shifted, and coughed hard. The video wobbled slightly, then steadied again. "Dog, if you're still alive, I'm sorry. I never meant to leave you." The screen froze. Then came the real punch, footage not just of documents or scans, but of towns Grant recognized, little communities nestled deep in forgotten corners of the state. Grainy footage showed unmarked convoys entering, no one exited. Timestamps, dates, then the fires that were ruled as electrical, natural, or never reported at all. But here they were, burning structures, bodies moved by hazmat suits, everything covered in smoke and silence. The dog let out a low, broken sound. It wasn't a growl or a whine, it was somewhere in between, something Grant had never heard before, a sound made of memory and heartbreak. He laid his head against the crate, eyes half closed, as if the weight of his entire life had just collapsed around him. Grant stared at the screen, Julian's face frozen, the fire burning behind him, the final act of a man who had given everything to expose something the world wasn't allowed to see. And a dog, his dog, who had never stopped trying to finish that mission. This was the truth? And now Grant held it. But truth like this didn't come without consequences. Because right then, the forest fell silent again. No birds, no wind, just one sound, the sharp buzz of the drone, followed by another, then the soft, calculated clicks of boots on wet rock. They had company, and it wasn't the kind that offered help. The dog stood, slow but steady. His ears perked, his posture shifted, not afraid, ready. Because for the first time since that wreck went down, there was hope. Not escape, not rescue. Hope. Hope that someone would finally carry the truth out of this place. Hope that what Julian died for wouldn't vanish in smoke. And the dog, beaten, scarred, loyal beyond anything Grant had ever known, wasn't just guiding him now, he was defending him, one last time. The clearing ahead wasn't just a place, it was a crossroads. The wreck behind them, the forest circling with quiet threat, and the open slope bathed in weak mountain light, it all felt final. The dog slowed only once, panting now, his strength beginning to falter. Grant knelt beside him, placing a hand on his chest. His heartbeat was there, but slower than before, still steady, still willing. But the dog had already given too much. Time, strength, hunger, none of it stopped him. But Grant saw it now, the cost was catching up. Still, the dog stood because they had made it. From his pack, Grant pulled the flare gun, old but loaded. He hesitated, knowing this was the last card to play. Once fired, it would bring everything, attention, rescue, or threat. It wouldn't matter, they were out of time. He lit the flare and sent it roaring into the air. The red streak cut through the fog like a scream. For a moment, everything was still. And then in the distance, rotors, a chopper, too far to see. Not military? Civilian? Or search and rescue? Maybe both, maybe neither. But it was movement, a chance, a threat of something like survival. But it came with company. From the ridgeline, two men appeared. Unmarked gear, silent communication, rifles cradled casually but ready. Not rescue, cleanup. Grant stood, the canister strapped tight, the tablet zipped into the front pouch of his jacket. The dog moved next to him, limping now, legs trembling under the weight of his loyalty. But his eyes burned with the same fire they had when Grant first met him. Not fear, resolve. The men didn't shout, they didn't demand. They just raised their weapons. Grant didn't run, neither did the dog, because running had never been the mission. He held his ground, raised his arms just enough to show the tablet. The flare still crackled above, painting the sky in blood-red warnings. For the first time, Grant saw hesitation in their posture. They weren't expecting resistance, especially not from someone who looked like he belonged to the forest, especially not from a dog who looked like he'd already died once and refused to stay down. Then came the roar. The chopper emerged over the trees. Real rescue, not part of the cleanup. They had minutes, maybe seconds. One of the men shifted forward. The dog growled, deep and primal, the kind of sound that stops movement before it begins. That growl said one thing, you'll go through me first. And somehow that was enough. The men backed off. Not far, but enough. The flare had changed the stakes, too public, too messy. The chopper spotlight cut through the trees, blinding everyone. The sound was deafening. Voices on loudspeakers. And then feet hit the ground, rescue boots, real ones, uniforms, medics. They found Grant and the dog at the edge of the clearing, both collapsed, the pack secured tightly in Grant's arms, the dog's head resting on his boot. One rescuer whispered, "What the hell happened here?" Grant didn't speak. He just nodded toward the dog. He waited, he said, longer than anyone ever should have had to. The dog's eyes were half closed now, finally allowed to let go. The last weight on his soul had been passed on. He had guarded more than a wreck, he had protected a promise. And now finally someone had listened. That's the part the world will never see. Not the documents, not the drone, but the silent hours, the days of cold, the months of isolation, the loyalty, the love, and the unwavering belief that someone would come. The dog had waited, and against all odds, someone did. That's the part the world forgets. But not this time.